The Zodiac Killer gave America a name, a symbol, and a stack of letters. What he never gave investigators was the one thing they actually needed: proof of who he was. More than 50 years later, that is still the strangest part of the Zodiac case. Police had survivors. They had witnesses. They had bullets, fingerprints, handwriting, letters, envelopes, pieces of clothing, and eventually even solved ciphers. They had suspects. They had one suspect in particular who would become almost inseparable from the Zodiac story. And still, no one was ever charged as the Zodiac Killer. So how can a case leave behind this much evidence, become one of the most famous murder investigations in American history, and still end without a name? The core story begins on December 20, 1968. 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen were parked near Lake Herman Road in Northern California. At some point that night, someone approached them. David was shot. Betty Lou tried to run. She was shot multiple times and died only a short distance from the car. There was no famous Zodiac symbol yet. No cipher, no theatrical letters. Just two teenagers dead on a quiet road, and investigators trying to understand why. Then, about 6 months later, it happened again. On July 4, 1969, 22-year-old Darlene Ferrin and 19-year-old Michael Mageau were sitting in a parked car at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. Another vehicle arrived. A man approached their car and opened fire. Darlene Ferrin died. Michael Mageau survived. And this time the killer did something that would change the investigation completely. Shortly after the shooting, a man called the Vallejo Police Department. He reported the attack. Then he claimed responsibility for it. And he also claimed responsibility for the Lake Herman Road murders from the previous December. For the first time, investigators had reason to believe the two attacks might be connected. But the killer was only beginning. On July 31, 1969, 3 Bay Area newspapers received letters. Each letter contained part of a coded message. The writer claimed responsibility for the murders and demanded that the ciphers be printed. Then, a few days later, another letter arrived. It began with a sentence that would become infamous. "This is the Zodiac speaking." And with that, the killer gave himself an identity. Not his real identity, a public identity. Zodiac. That distinction matters. Because from this point forward, the killer was no longer only committing crimes. He was creating a character. He sent letters. He used the crosshair symbol. He wrote in ciphers. He threatened more violence. And every time a newspaper printed one of those messages, the mythology grew. The investigation was now happening in 2 places at once, at crime scenes and in public. Then, on September 27, 1969, another attack happened near Lake Berryessa. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were relaxing beside the lake when a man approached them wearing a dark hood marked with the Zodiac symbol. He tied them up. Then he stabbed them repeatedly. Brian Hartnell survived. Cecilia Shepard died 2 days later. Before leaving, the attacker wrote on Hartnell's car door. He listed dates connected to previous attacks. Then came one of the most important murders in the entire Zodiac story. October 11, 1969. San Francisco taxi driver Paul Stine picked up a passenger. When the taxi reached the Presidio Heights neighborhood, the passenger shot Stine in the head. Witnesses saw a man near the cab. Police responded, but the killer escaped. Then Zodiac sent another letter. Inside was a piece of Paul Stine's blood-stained shirt. That changed everything. Up to that point, police always had to consider an obvious question. Was the person writing the letters really the killer? After the Stine letter, that question became much harder to dismiss. Whoever sent that piece of shirt had access to evidence directly connected to the murder. Now, investigators had what looked like an enormous collection of clues. Handwriting, fingerprints, witness descriptions, ballistics, letters, envelopes, ciphers, physical evidence from several crime scenes. Local police departments worked the murders, while the FBI provided laboratory assistance in areas such as handwriting analysis, fingerprints, and cryptanalysis. But the FBI was not running one giant federal Zodiac murder case. These were primarily local homicide investigations spread across different jurisdictions, and that fragmentation mattered. Different agencies had different evidence, different witnesses, different suspects, different pieces of the puzzle. Still, one question kept getting louder. With all of this evidence, how did they not identify him? Part of the answer is that evidence can look much stronger from a distance than it really is. A fingerprint is powerful if investigators can prove where it came from and match it reliably to a suspect. A handwriting comparison can be useful, but it does not automatically identify a writer. A witness description can narrow the search, but it does not put a legal name behind a mask. And a cipher can reveal a message without revealing the person who wrote it. Then came the suspects. Over the decades, many names have been proposed, but one became more famous than the others. Arthur Lee Allen. Allen attracted serious police attention. Investigators questioned him. They searched his property, and several circumstantial details made him appear suspicious enough that his name would follow the case for decades. But suspicion is where the story becomes dangerous, because a person can look like a compelling suspect without the evidence ever becoming strong enough to prove that person committed the crime. Allen's handwriting did not establish him as the author of the Zodiac letters. Fingerprints did not prove that he was Zodiac. No prosecution ever established in court that Arthur Lee Allen was the killer. He died in 1992, and yet his name became so closely associated with the case that many people today speak about him as if the mystery were almost settled. It was not. He was a suspect. That is not the same thing as a proven killer. And this is where the Zodiac story becomes more interesting than the mythology surrounding it. Because for decades people kept expecting one final clue to solve everything. Maybe the handwriting. Maybe the fingerprints. Maybe a suspect's belongings. Maybe one of the ciphers. And in 2020, something remarkable finally happened. One of Zodiac's most famous unsolved ciphers, known as the Z340, was cracked more than 50 years after it had been sent. For a moment, it sounded like exactly the kind of breakthrough the case had been waiting for. A cipher that had resisted experts for half a century had finally been solved. But the message did not contain Zodiac's real name. After 51 years, one of the case's greatest mysteries produced words, not an identity. And that may be the perfect summary of the entire investigation. The Zodiac case has never suffered from a lack of clues. It has suffered from a lack of a reliable bridge between those clues and one identifiable person. That is why new theories appear again and again. A family finds old photographs. Someone discovers a possible handwriting similarity. A private group announces a suspect. A documentary identifies a new connection. And suddenly the case appears solved all over again. But solving a famous mystery in public is not the same thing as proving a homicide case. There was no Zodiac trial. There was no conviction. There was no courtroom where the evidence against one identified defendant was tested and found sufficient to establish that he was the Zodiac Killer. That does not mean every theory is worthless. It means theories and proof are different things. And for the victims, that difference matters. David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, Paul Stine. Michael Mageau survived. Brian Hartnell survived. Behind the ciphers, symbols, films, books, and endless suspect lists were real people whose lives were permanently changed. The mythology became enormous. The legal conclusion never did. More than half a century later, the Zodiac Killer remains unidentified in any legally established sense. And maybe that is why the case still holds so much power. Zodiac succeeded in creating a name that everyone remembers. He created a symbol that became instantly recognizable. He turned murder into correspondence, correspondence into spectacle, and spectacle into legend. But history remembers something else too. For all the letters he sent, all the clues he left, and all the attention he demanded, investigators never obtained the final piece they needed. A provable identity. The name became history. The proof never did.